if you remember nothing else from this sermon, please remember this. The building is closed. The church is open. Again, the building is closed. The church is open. Today we get a primer in what is the church. And perhaps there's no better starting point than the church school song. The church is not a building. The church is not a steeple. The church is not a resting place. The church is the people. And certainly we understand that reality. Not only when we're gathered in this space, but certainly as we are a virtual community over the past few months. The community is such an important aspect of what it is to be church. However, like so many things, it's always helpful to tweak just a little bit. And perhaps the convoluted prayer that Jesus prays in our gospel for today is one that will help us understand a bit more of how we see and are the church. Jesus is with his disciples in John's gospel in the upper room prior to his arrest and ultimate execution. And he's praying this prayer on behalf of the disciples who are with him, his friends, but he also prays it on behalf of all of those who have followed, the church that emerged and has continued throughout the centuries. And in essence, what Jesus is praying is this: the future of the faith community belongs to God. Jesus and the Father are one, as well as the people who are with Jesus. They are all one. And as he is leaving, God will protect. This is the ground for us as a community. The future of the faith community belongs to God, which I think we oftentimes forget, because we have busy lives and we're responsible for so many things, and we need to do all sorts of things to succeed and survive in this world. So much so that we then lose sight of the reality of the grace that undergirds our very existence, the world, the life that we have, and the community of faith that we're a part of. It's not what we do ultimately. It's what God has always already done. And one theologian talked about our understanding of community as this, or he asked the question, what does it look like if our starting point is that we are a community for whom Jesus prays? What does our life look like if that's how we understand ourselves? Not that we're together because we're from a certain geographic place, not that we come together because of a socioeconomic background that is similar, not that we're together because we have certain political views, but that at a very fundamental core, we are together because Jesus has been praying for us. The prayer that he promised to pray for on behalf of his disciples in the gospel today, and that which has been continued on throughout the centuries. What does our life look like? Not so much that we have to do everything, but that we are invited into this world and this life and this ministry because of what God has already done. Our programs, our buildings, our capital campaigns, you and I are not ultimately responsible for all of this, but God is. And that liberates us to then live more fully into the life that we've been given and to the ministry that we are a part of. And all of this has extreme importance at this time in our history. Because while we are living through this pandemic, we are now at a point where many are talking about re-entering churches. And there is a wide divide as to how that might take place and when that might take place. But particularly troubling are those who are citing the First Amendment, that their right is to be able to practice whenever and wherever they want. And while we certainly hold up that right, perhaps this is not the time to necessarily raise that flag. Indeed, it's ironic that we are having this conversation this weekend, Memorial Day weekend, when we remember those who have given their lives for this country and for our rights and our freedoms and our liberties. The question that we need to ask at this time is, how do we honor them? And do we honor them by demanding our rights, selfishly exercising what it is that we can? Or do we honor them by embodying what it is that they manifest? Selflessness, service, and sacrifice. Again, this is an important issue at this time. We are not called to go to church. Rather, we are called to be the church. And that should inform what it is that we do in this time and in each time. This past week, I was a part of a clergy meeting in Stamford where we were discussing this very issue of re-entering churches. And it was fascinating. The Presbyterian Church, the Congregational Church, the Methodist Church, all of them said without blinking, we aren't even considering going back into our spaces until September. And on the other side of the continuum were the Orthodox churches, whose bishops throughout the country have required all of them to go back into their spaces and to invite people into them as well. What's more, some of the bishops are requiring their priests to serve communion in the traditional way, which means that they take a spoon and they take some of the bread, dip it with the wine, and they serve it in the mouth of each communicant. And it's the same spoon that is used throughout. This is not faithfulness. This is reckless endangerment. It is not necessarily effective for us to be the church in this space at this time. What is effective is for us to be the church by loving and caring for people and using our minds. The president in his address yesterday talked about the fact that we need prayer more now than ever. However, he misunderstood where prayer takes place. It doesn't have to happen just in this space. It happens everywhere, at all times. And it can happen now, beyond these walls. Indeed, it is happening as you are with us and all other communities are gathering virtually on this Sunday. It's important for us to remember that. For those who are adamant about getting back into their worship spaces, I would only hold up this reference. Jesus' encounter with the Samaritan woman at the well in John's Gospel. At the end of their conversation, Jesus says, "There will come a time that you will worship God, not just on this mountain, nor in Jerusalem, but you will worship God in spirit and in truth." He said it not just to her, but Jesus said that for all of us. God cannot be bound by a physical space. God is everywhere. And we worship God in all sorts of ways. Certainly gathering in this space or the historic church or whatever worship space is central to whomever means a great deal. And it will be wonderful to have people back together. But we don't need to threaten people's lives. And we need to understand that the worship of God takes place in all places. Another thing that I was struck by this past week was an interview with the chief chaplain of the Army, Major General Thomas Soliam. He was talking about how they help prepare soldiers for re-entry, soldiers who are coming out of the theater of war, and what it's going to be like when they go back and they are with their families and their friends, and dealing with what is a very real issue for so many, post-traumatic stress. And then Solon talked about an encounter he had with a sergeant major of the Army, the highest enlisted rank that is offered in the Army. The sergeant major asked him one day, "You talk about all of this post-traumatic stress, but I never hear you talk about post-traumatic growth." And Solon said, "I'm not exactly sure I understand what you're saying, Sergeant Major. Can you expound on that a little bit more?" The sergeant said, "I've been through all sorts of stressful experiences, traumatic experiences in my Army career, and I'm better for it. I'm a better man, a better husband, a better friend, a better sergeant major." And it's not that you wish trauma on anyone, but it's important to understand that in the crucible of that event or those events, everything is crystallized. What's important and what matters, and how it is that we can become the better versions of ourselves. And I would say that this is a time that we are experiencing exactly that. For indeed, there will be those who come out of this with post-traumatic stress. But for us as individuals and as a community, one of the things that we can consider is, what does post-traumatic growth look like? What is it that we have experienced during this time that we will want to continue, that helps us be a better version of ourselves? What are the relationships that we have developed that are critical? How do we understand what it is that we do as the church, as individuals, that more fully reflect God's presence in the world? Something critical for us to remember. And again, for those who are wanting to rush back into a specific space, I leave you and them with this. It's the words of the Bishop of the Episcopal Diocese in Missouri, Dion K. Johnson. The work of the church is essential. The work of caring for the lonely, the marginalized, and the oppressed is essential. The work of speaking truth to power and seeking justice is essential. The work of being a loving, liberating, and life-giving presence in the world is essential. The work of welcoming the stranger, the refugee, and the undocumented is essential. The work of reconciliation and healing and caring is essential. The church does not need to be open, because the church never closed. We who make up the body of Christ, the church, love God and our neighbors and ourselves so much that we will stay away from our buildings until it is safe. We are the church.